We've been knowing for a long time that Hezbollah was planning a significant retaliation to the killing last month of a man by the name of Fuad Shukar, who was Hezbollah's top military commander. Israel took him out and eliminated him in an apartment in Beirut in retaliation for the killing of 12 children, Druze, Arab children, in northern Israel in a town called Majd al-Shams, where Hezbollah had fired a rocket that landed in a soccer pitch, a football field, and killed those 12 kids. And that was Israel's response to that attack. And Hezbollah vowed to retaliate in a big way. And Israel had been waiting with great anticipation to see what would happen. What happened early this morning was that Israel got intelligence, maybe from satellites, maybe from drones, maybe from human agents on the ground, indicating that Hezbollah was preparing for this massive attack, maybe into the thousands of rockets and missiles that would be launched into the center of the country. Israel took preemptive action just apparently minutes before those missiles were supposed to be launched and eliminated and neutralized that threat. Of course, Hezbollah still has many more rockets and missiles. We're told to believe that Hezbollah has over 150,000 rockets and missiles that cover the entire state of Israel with their range and their different sizes. So this is a drop in the bucket to some extent, but this was meant to be Hezbollah's big launch and big retaliation. It still was able to fire several hundred rockets. Some of them did land inside Israeli cities, causing damage. Some of them landed, and some drones hit and struck Israeli highways. It was not as big as what Hezbollah seemed to have been planning, but the question now will be, what does Hezbollah decide to do? So there was obviously a very high level of alert that has now gone down a bit. For example, the Ben Gurion International Airport just south of Tel Aviv was shut down originally until 10 a.m. in Israel. Then it was reopened at 7 a.m. So it's a question really to see what Hezbollah's next move will be and whether it suffices with those 350, 400 rockets that it did succeed in launching into Israel, or does it still feel this desire and urge that it needs to get something launched into the center of Israel, into the Tel Aviv area? And then if they still decide to go down that road and they strike in Tel Aviv, that would, my assumption would be it would provoke Israel to also retaliate in a big way in Beirut, and then we're on a path towards a wider escalation. So the ball, for the time being, remains in Hezbollah's court. A ground offensive in Lebanon is always going to be an option, especially if the war widens. I think that Israel's preference would be to avoid that. I think that we have in the region right now, let's not forget, a massive military buildup of U.S. forces that are also here that could play a role in on the definite hand in defending Israel, but maybe also in striking some of those targets if it leads to that. So I don't know that a ground offensive, it would not be the immediate response. The immediate response would first be from the air. And by the way, that's always just going to be a military tactical decision. You want to try to soften the targets, right? You want to eliminate as much as possible from the air before you send the troops on the ground. So that will be something that I think, if that war does expand, that's how we'll see it play out. Although there always is the possibility that if Hezbollah starts to send its forces across the border, Israel will have no choice but to also send its troops into Lebanon to push back those Hezbollah forces so they cannot cross into Israeli territory. So we'll have to wait and see exactly where this goes and how it develops. And we will know in the next few days, definitely. Anything is possible with Hezbollah and with Iran, of course, which is behind the scenes to some extent pulling the strings. What we have to remember is that since October 7th, when Israel was attacked in a brutal way by Hamas from Gaza, what we've seen in the 10 months plus since then is that all of these different fronts or enemies that Israel used to fight individually against, whether it was Hezbollah or Hamas or the Houthis in Yemen or the Iranian militias, the Shia militias of Syria or Iran itself, everyone today is connected. And it's one united front against the state of Israel. So the assumption always has to be for Israel now that whenever you attack one or whenever you're engaged in a battle with one, this could easily lead to a battle with more or with all. And therefore, if Hezbollah were to decide that it wants to attack once again, definitely has the capability, it definitely has the desire, we know, to some extent, although now it has to recalculate. And it can also rely on some of its friends and allies, like the Iranians, like the Shia militias in Syria, like Hamas in Gaza, although their capabilities have been degraded. The Houthis in Yemen, who have successfully in the past struck Tel Aviv with drones. So this is not something that they would have to necessarily do on their own. And therefore, this size and scope of what they did plan for Sunday morning, they could do it again and probably again and even more than what they tried to do. An October 7th style Hezbollah attack is always a possibility, and it would be irresponsible to assume that they cannot do it. I think one of the lessons of October 7th for Israel is always assume the worst and don't think that you have your enemy contained and under control. So we have to assume that such an option does exist and can happen. With that said, what has happened since October 7th, and more specifically since October 8th of last year, when Hezbollah started attacking Israel the day after, about 60,000 Israelis evacuated their homes along that border in the north, not because of the rockets, but because of the fear that Hezbollah does have tunnels, does have a way to storm the border, and can carry out an attack much larger than what Hamas did on the border with Gaza, where, let's remember, they killed 1,200 plus people and abducted another 250. So most of those people along the border have left their homes, unfortunately, and have not yet been able to go back because of exactly that fear of an October 7th style attack. So the real possibility does exist, and this is what makes this so complicated, is that to get these people to go back to their homes, they are demanding, and Israel is demanding, that Hezbollah move away from the northern border, that it not be deployed along the border with Israel like it was up until this time. And Israel has been, yes, striking at some of those Hezbollah positions and capabilities along the border in response to the Hezbollah daily rocket attacks against Israel. But if Hezbollah is still deployed there, you have no guarantee for your people's safety and security. And this has been one of Israel's demands of any end to this conflict, is that Hezbollah move north, move farther away from the border so that there is not a direct and immediate threat on the Israeli residents who want to go back to their homes. A possibility of a ground offensive against Hezbollah in Lebanon always exists, right? And it's been on the table as an option ever since the end of the Second Lebanon War in the summer of 2006, when Israel did fight inside Lebanon for almost a month. The war itself was 34 days, but the ground offensive was slightly shorter than that. Hezbollah is much bigger, much larger, much stronger, and much more sophisticated in those 18 years that have passed since 2006. On the other hand, we know that to think that you can eliminate your enemy just from the air is foolish. It's not possible. If you really want to degrade your enemy's capabilities, you need to send boots on the ground, and you need to go between their different targets and their different command centers. You need to go into those bunkers and into those tunnels that Hezbollah has basically, by the way, shown us in just the last few days in different promotional videos that they've put out, of how they have massive underground bunker complexes which they can launch rockets from. They can move trucks inside. So this is not a small feat. And to really get to those, you would need to put people inside them and to go and weed out those different terrorist and different terrorist infrastructure. So that is a huge, massive undertaking. And we have to keep in mind that Israel still, as we speak, has troops on the ground in Gaza, is still trying to complete the war in the Gaza Strip, bringing down the rule of Hamas and finishing off the final battalions that Hamas still has. It says that it has broken about 22 out of the 24 battalions of Hamas, but there still are forces, and Israel wants to ensure that Hamas can never carry out another attack against Israel like on October 7th. So to now have to focus and move its ground forces to the north would mean that it would not be able to finish up in the south. It wouldn't be able to do both at the same time. It would have to really focus just on one. So that's consideration one. Consideration two is That would be a very big war, a very difficult war. And we've seen all indications are until now that Israel is trying to avoid that war. It's been trying to avoid that war for 10 months. It didn't need to wait for this morning to preemptively attack Hezbollah. Hezbollah has been attacking Israel since October 8th, every single day with rockets and drones and mortar shells. It has killed dozens of people, 12 kids just a couple weeks ago. There's all the reason right now to go in there and destroy them as much as possible. But Israel's trying to avoid that and not having to do it. But it could happen. And if this war does expand and all these rockets are unleashed on Israel, I don't think it will have much of a choice but to do and launch such a ground offensive. There was no war more justified, I think, than the war that Israel has been waging against Hamas in Gaza after the brutal massacre on October 7th. I think that everyone around the world understood, even those who, let's say, do not instinctively support the state of Israel, that this was one step too far by Hamas, and that Israel had every right to go into Gaza to try to destroy Hamas and to try to get back its people, a battle that it's still fighting 10 months later. But look what we saw in the 10 months that have passed. Israel has come under fierce international criticism. It has been taken to the International Court of Justice on charges of genocide. The Prime Minister of Israel and the Defense Minister of Israel are under consideration for arrest warrants to be issued against them by the International Criminal Court, the ICC. So it's not as if, and much of the world has already, for months now, been saying to Israel, wrap it up, stop it. There's been calls of genocide, even though the numbers are completely misunderstood of how many civilians have been killed, how many combatants have been killed. Every loss of life is obviously tragic, especially anywhere in the world, but in Gaza as well. But when when Hamas claims that 40,000 people have been killed and Israel claims that about 20,000 of those are combatants, then we have a civilian combatant ratio of about 1-to-1. That means for every combatant killed, one civilian, or even 1.5, it's a remarkable military achievement. And again, every loss of life is a tragedy on a civilian side, but if you look at previous conflicts all across the world over the last 100 years, usually the ratio is 1-to-6 or 1-to-9. Israel is changing that in a remarkable way. But still, people know that. Doesn't get Israel any credit. Now let's apply that same thinking to Lebanon. In Lebanon, we're facing so many more rockets, so many more enemy fighters. Israel would not have the ability to operate in Lebanon the way it did in Gaza. Remember, in Gaza, it dropped leaflets, it made phone calls, it said people in the north move to the south, people in the south move to the center, go back to the center, go back to the south, go back to the north. It kept on moving the people, which is, again, very difficult for the people, but it did that to protect them. Because of how many rockets will be launched at Israel, Israel will not have that luxury, and it will have to severely strike at Lebanon in a way that we have never seen before. And Israel has said this, by the way. This is not a secret. Israel has made this very clear. So it is said, as a result, you in Lebanon should want to avoid this war because it would be a devastating conflict for you as much as it would be for Israel. That will not gain Israel any friends around the world. On the contrary, even though everyone can say with what they just heard, yes, we understand and we agree, but that won't make Israel any friends. I think that Israel will come under even fiercer international condemnations, even more arrest warrants against its people. And that is also always going to have to be a consideration. War is a terrible thing. And as a result, I think when you look deep into how October 7th, for example, happened, and how did Israel allow under its nose for such a powerful terrorist army to grow in Gaza and also in Lebanon to a large extent? The answer really comes down to a desire in Israel to avoid war, right? Not to have to fight those wars because of how terrible they are. Forget about for the other side, which is, well, of course, important, but it's terrible for the Israeli side as well. And for that reason, it's tried to avoid it for as long as possible until it was forced into it. And I think that that's why we're continuing to see Israel trying to walk a very delicate balancing act with Lebanon and with Hezbollah. On the one hand, striking at them, trying to say to them, stop, but on the other hand, not going all the way and launching a preemptive strike. Even this preemptive strike, for example, was focused on just what Hezbollah was going to fire at Israel. It could have been more broadly focused on many more Hezbollah capabilities and targets, but Israel didn't do that. Again, a message to Hezbollah: we're just taking out what you're about to throw at us, but we're not looking for a bigger war. So there's a lot of messaging and signaling that goes on, even in the selection of targets and in the way that you respond to something that the other side does. I'm very cautious in trying to predict anything that happens in this region because it's so volatile and so unpredictable. However, I think that it's really going to be a question of what Hezbollah wants right now, and whether it decides that what happened early this morning is enough for now, and we can go back to what was, which, let's remember, still was firing rockets every single day at Israel, but just not in this larger capacity like what we saw this morning. So it really will depend on what they decide to do and how they decide to progress. Israel's interest is for there to be quiet, and Israel's interest is for this war not to expand. And let's hope that Israel can keep that from happening.